In this lecture, we'll be converting the model-driven form we've been building so far in this section into a template-driven form. By the end of this lecture, you'll know the differences and similarities between template-driven forms and model-driven forms. You'll also know how to use the ngModel directive to link template input controls to properties on the component. And you'll also learn how to implement form validation in the template-driven approach, as well as how to submit and reset a form. So the key in understanding the template-driven approach is that it still uses the same models as the model-driven approach. In the template-driven approach, Angular creates the models, the form groups, and the form controls for us via directives we add to the template. That's why in this course we teach the model-driven approach first. So you'll have a good knowledge of the underlying model structure that is still present in template-driven forms. Now, to implement our template-driven form, we'll create a basic form component. Exactly the same as the model form component we started with in this section, with a basic form template and a dynamic select box. So the only difference is really that I'm calling this a template form component instead of model form component, and it has a slightly different selector. I've already set up the select box to be dynamic, and the rest of the input fields are pretty much the same as how we started with the model-driven form. So if I run the application, you'll recognize the form on the right-hand side. The directives we need to build template-driven forms are in the Forms module, not the Reactive Forms module. So let's import that and add it to our ngModule as an import. So we import the Forms module from Angular Forms, and then we add it to the imports of our ngModule. So one of the directives pulled in via the Forms module is called ngForm, and this directive has a selector which matches the form tag. So just by adding the Forms module to our ngModule's imports, our template form is already associated with an instance of the ngForm directive. This instance of ngForm, this instance that Angular created automatically just because it saw a form tag, this is hidden by default. But we can expose it with a local template reference variable attached to the form element. So unlike previous template reference variables we've added in the past, this one we assign to a value. So previously we would have just used the hash symbol with some text. By default, if we just use that syntax, it will create a template reference variable attached to the element. By pointing the ngForm to this reference variable, f now points to the instance of ngForm. One of the cool things that ngForm directive does is create a top-level form group and lets us call functions on the ngForm directive as if it was an instance of a form group. And if you remember, one of the properties on a form group was value. This is an object representation of all of the form's controls. So just like model-driven forms, we can still output an object representation of the form to the screen with just a simple pre-tag. So we get a reference to our ngForm directive by just using the variable f. We can then call .value on the ngForm directive just the same way as we call .value on the form group in the model-driven forms. And then again, just like before, we can just pipe it to JSON and it will print out the content of the form model to the page. So let's run this and see what happens. So you can see we have an empty object at the bottom. But as I enter data into the form, we can see that this empty object isn't updating. That's because although the ngForm directive creates this top-level form group instance, it doesn't automatically scan its own content and generate form controls for each of the template form controls inside itself. So although it's created a top-level form group, it's an empty form group. And we need to go through and explicitly register each template control with the ngForm directive. In model-driven forms, we added the FormControl name directive to map a template form control to an existing model form control on the component. But in template-driven forms, we need Angular to create the model form controls for us for each template form control. To do that, we need to do two things to each template form control. Number one, we need to add the ngModel directive. And number two, we need to add the name attribute. So let's create them for the email input field. So number one, we add the ngModel directive. And number two, we give the input control a name. It has to have a name. As long as the input control has the ngModel directive attached and it has a name, the ngModel directive then creates a FormControl instance to manage the template form control. And the name attribute tells the ngModel directive what key to store that form control under in the parent form group. So now that we've added this to the email input control, let's have a look at what happens to our form when we rerun it. So you can see the JSON representation of our form. It now contains an email field. Now it's called email because we set the name of the input field to be email. If we set the name of the input field to be foo, and then let's rerun, then the ngModel directive, when it creates the form control instance, will create it under the key of foo. That's why the name attribute is really important. And also now if we type into the email field, we can see it updating in the form model underneath. So just to summarize, what's happened so far is that the ngForm directive has been automatically attached to the form template. It's then created a top-level form group instance, and by adding in ngModel and a name to an input control, ngModel directive has created a form control instance and added that to the top-level form group. So what's happening right now is we're just creating that form model. We're just creating it, but not explicitly via instances of form groups we're adding to a component, but actually just through directives that we're adding through the template. That's why this is called the template-driven approach. I'm now going to pause the video for a second, and I'm just going to finish off the rest of this form and add the ngModel directive to the other elements. Now I've gone through the form and I've added the ngModel attribute for each of the fields with the appropriate name attribute as well. And you can see at the bottom we now have a full JSON representation of our form. But if you look closely, this isn't exactly the same as before. In our model-driven form, we grouped the first name and last name under another group called name. And we can do the same in template-driven forms with the ngModel group directive. Let's add that to the parent field set element of our first name and last name fields. So on the element which is wrapping our first name and last name fields, I've added the directive ngModel group and I've given it a name. So on the parent element of our first name and last name fields, I've added the directive ngModel group and I've assigned it a value which will be the key of the top level form group. So to match what we had before, I'm calling it name. So now if we rerun the application, you can see now that first name and last name now nest under a parent form group called name, just like we had before. So now we've mirrored the model we created in the model-driven form, but using template-driven forms with form controls and a nested form group. But another really cool feature of the ngModel directive is that it lets us set up two-way data binding between a template form control and a variable on our component. So when the user changes the value in the template form control, the value of the variable it's linked to on the component automatically changes as well. And then when we change the value of the variable on the component, the template form control will automatically update as well. Now the syntax for using the ngModel directive in this way is a little bit different. Let's set this up for our email field. But to actually hold the value of the email, let's also create a string property called email on our component. So I want to link this email property on the component to the input field in our template. And to do that, I'm going to use two-way data binding by using the ngModel directive. So let me scroll up to the email field. And I'm going to do something that might look a little bit strange initially, but I will explain it. So this syntax you see here is actually a shortcut. Just to explain what's going on here, let me write the long form way of performing two-way data binding. So hopefully now that we've written it in the long form syntax, things should start making a bit more sense. We bind into, as an input into the ngModel directive, the email property on our component. And then the ngModel directive also outputs an event called ngModel change. And whatever gets published on that event, this is what we assign to the email property on our component. And so that's what's going on here. The first one is we're binding as an input into ngModel, and the second one is an output from ngModel, which we're assigning to email. But we can shorten this all to just this syntax here. Square brackets, round brackets, square brackets. And some people are calling this the box of bananas syntax. But in Angular, we typically won't data bind to a simple string or object on our component, but instead we'll bind to something like a domain model, something we've defined via a class. So let's create one for our sign-up form called signup. And then in our component, let's just add a property called model. And now let's go through our form and bind all of our input controls to our model directly by using two-way data binding. So for example, in the email field, instead of binding to email, I want to bind to model.email, so our domain model. I'm now going to go through the rest of the form and implement two-way data binding. Okay, now I've gone through the rest of the form and I've implemented two-way data binding for the rest of the form controls. Now let's talk about validation. In the model-driven approach, we define the validators via code in the component. In the template-driven approach, we define the validators via directives and HTML attributes on our template itself. Let's start adding validators to our form template. All the fields apart from the language field were required, so we'll just add the required attribute to those input fields. And the email field also had a pattern validator, and we can add that via an attribute as well, via the pattern attribute. So you just say pattern is equal to, and then you provide the regular expression, and I'm providing the same regular expression that I used in the model-driven forms. And the password field also had a min-length validator, and again we can add that via an attribute as well. So the attribute is just min-length, and then we provide it the minimum length of that field. Now the only other validator that's available to us right now by default is the max length validator, which is just the same as the min-length validator, but validates that a field can't have more than a certain number of characters. Now the validators that we're adding, these attributes, These are not Angular only. These are part of the HTML5 specification, and you can put them in any form, whether you're using Angular or not. But however, in Angular, just like how it automatically created an ngForm directive and attached it to the form, because the ngForm directive has a selector of form, it also has some other directives which have selectors that match pattern, required, min length, and max length. So just by adding these attributes to our input controls, we're actually also attaching other hidden directives to our input controls, and those hidden directives are implement validation for us. And later on in the course, we'll be covering how we can create our own custom validators that even work in the template-driven approach like this. So similar to model-driven forms, we can access each model's form control state by going through the top-level form group. So the ngForm directive makes a top-level form group available to us via the form property. So we can show things like the valid, dirty, or touch state of our email field, just like this. So I'm still using the email field as a good example for all of this stuff. I'm just going to copy and paste the code in, like so. So we go through our template reference variable f, which points to our ngForm directive. We can then get an instance of the form group with .form. And then the syntax is exactly the same as if we were dealing with a form group. So we do .controls and then .email for the email field. And then we have something new. We have this question mark character, and I'll explain that in a second. But then we can just call .valid, .dirty, .touched. So this question mark character is a special character. It's called the Elvis operator. It means only try to call the property on the right of the question mark if the property on the left of the question mark is not null. So if this is null or undefined, it won't bother trying to check for a property of valid because this is undefined or null. It's not going to have a property of valid. We know it's not going to have a property of valid. And all this will achieve is causing an error in Angular. If the email field is an actual value, not null or not undefined, only then will it then check to see what the valid property is. So the reason we do this is that in template-driven forms, the controls can sometimes be null when Angular is building the page. So to be safe, we use the Elvis operator. Now we don't need to use the Elvis operator in model-driven forms since the models are created already in our component by the time the HTML form is shown on the page. But back to validation. So again, similar to model-driven forms, we can use this in conjunction with the ngClass directive and the validation classes from Twitter Bootstrap to style our form to give visual feedback to the user when it's invalid. So just like model-driven forms, I want to conditionally add the has danger or has success classes to our email field, to the form group, the top level form group for our email field, like so. And it's either dirty or it's been touched. And I'm going to show the opposite has success class if the email field is valid. And again, it's either been dirty or it's been touched. So now if I run our application, and now I take a look at the email field and I start typing something in. So right now it's invalid, the valid is false. It's not dirty and it's not been touched. So now if I type A, it's still invalid, it's dirty, and it's not going to be touched because we haven't actually moved out from it yet. And here we go, asim at. So now the email field is valid and we're showing a green border. Now the expression we've written here is actually again pretty long. We've got to write f.form.controls.email elvis.invalid. Quite a lot of text to write, and you can see it results in just a lot of boilerplate code on the screen, a long expression. But the ngForm directive does provide us with a shortcut to the controls property. So we can write just f.controls. We don't need to type f.form. But both are still pretty wordy, and if we wanted to get access to the nested form control like first name and last name, just like before, it can be even more cumbersome. But using the ngModel directive provides us with a much shorter alternative. We can get access to the instance of our ngModel directive by using a local template reference variable. So for our email field, I'm going to add a local template reference variable called email. And I'm going to make this email template reference variable point to our ngModel directive itself. So the ngModel directive which we attached to our input control. And since the ngModel directive created the underlying form control instance, we can now get a reference to that underlying form control instance just by using the email template reference variable. So now we can shorten our validation class expressions and rewrite our template code to this. And then because of the way the ngModel directive is created, we can also remove the Elvis operator as well. And a really important thing to notice here is that as long as we've named our local reference variable here, the same name we named our form controls in the model-driven version of this form, we can actually just use exactly the same ngClass syntax. This is exactly the same as we had in the model-driven forms. And as for form validation messages, we can now use exactly the same method that we used in model-driven forms. As long as we name the local reference variable the same as the form controls in the model-driven form approach, we can use exactly the same HTML in our template-driven forms. So I'm just going to copy and paste in exactly the same validation markup code that we had from the model-driven approach. Here we go. And now I'll just rerun the application. And if I tap into the email field and tap out, we can see the email is required is getting rendered out. And then as I type into the field, you can then see we also see the email must contain at least the @ character message being printed out. And then once everything's fine, it just prints out the green border. So now we've got validation and styling and validation error messages functioning in our template-driven forms. Let's now look at how we can submit our form. So to submit a form, it's exactly the same as in model-driven forms. We need to add a submit button. This is just a button with a type is equal to submit, somewhere between the opening and closing form tags. So I add this button at the end of our form, and then I'm going to add the ngSubmit directive into our top of our form tag. And I'm going to bind it to the onSubmit function on our component. And I'm just going to log out a message to the console when the form is submitted. However, we don't really want the form submitted when the form is invalid. We can easily disable the submit button, however, when the form is invalid by binding to the disabled property. So if our form is invalid, if that is true, then the button will be disabled. So now if I rerun the application, hopefully you can see this when I hover over the submit button, a little circle with a line across it is shown, and that means the button is disabled. But as soon as the form becomes fully valid, the button is now available for us to click on. So that's how we submit a form. How do we actually reset a form in the template-driven approach? So in the model-driven approach, we reset the form by calling the function reset on our myForm model. We need a way to do something similar in our template-driven approach, but we don't actually have access to the underlying form model in our component. We only have access to it in our template via our local reference variable f.form. However, we can get a reference to the ngForm instance in our component code by using a viewChild decorator, which we covered in the section on components earlier in this course. This decorator gives us a reference in our component to something in our template. First, we create a property on our component to hold our instance of ngForm. I'm just creating a property called form. Then we want to include the viewChild decorator from Angular core. Finally, we decorate our property with the viewChild decorator. And we pass to viewChild the name of the local reference variable we want to link to. So we called our local reference variable f, so we're going to pass that. And then in our onSubmit function, we can just call form.reset like we did in the model-driven approach. And in fact, now that we have a reference to the form, we can also check for validity. And now if I rerun the application, let me fill out the form. And now when I press submit, it resets the form back to its pristine condition. So to summarize, in this lecture we converted our model-driven form into a template-driven form. We learned that the template-driven form still uses the same classes as the model-driven form, but in the template-driven approach, the models are created by directives in the template instead of explicitly created on the component itself. We learn all about the ngForm directive and how it automatically attaches to form tags in our HTML and creates a top-level form group for us. We learn about the Elvis operator and how we can use it when some properties in a dot chain can be undefined or null. We learned how to use the ngModel directive. We learned how it creates the FormControl instance for us and how we can use it to implement two-way data binding to a domain model on our component. We then also learned how to use a domain model in Angular. And finally, we learned how to implement validation in template-driven forms, as well as how to submit and reset a form.